The Cry in the Night. Dr. Michael Anderson trudged wearily through the dimly lit parking lot of Willow Creek General Hospital, his white coat draped over one arm, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. It had been another grueling 12-hour shift, filled with back-to-back surgeries, tense diagnoses, and the ever-present pressure that came with being one of the town's top surgeons. He let out a heavy sigh as he reached his car, fumbling for his keys in his pocket. The night air was crisp, a welcome contrast to the sterile scent of the hospital. Just as he was about to unlock the door, a sound cut through the silence. A soft, desperate cry. Michael's pulse quickened. He paused, scanning the nearly deserted lot. The cry came again. Small, fragile, lost. He turned, following the sound toward the emergency entrance. His breath caught when he spotted a small bundle nestled between the large dumpsters near the wall. A baby. His feet moved before his mind could process the sight. He knelt down, hands trembling as he gently peeled back the tattered blanket, revealing a tiny, whimpering infant, barely a few weeks old, his small face scrunched in distress. The first thing Michael noticed was the baby's beautiful brown skin, the soft curls of dark hair, and the wide, fearful eyes that locked onto his. The hospital lights cast a dim glow, and in that moment, Michael felt something inexplicable, a pull, a connection, a purpose. "Oh, little one," he whispered, voice cracking with emotion. "Who left you here?" The baby let out another tiny whimper, his tiny fingers curling toward Michael's chest, grasping at the fabric of his shirt. Michael scooped the infant up carefully, cradling him close as if his very presence could offer warmth and security. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who had abandoned this child? How long had he been out here in the cold? Why? With steady determination, Michael turned on his heel and strode back into the emergency room, past the nurses at the front desk. "Natalie," he called out to the head nurse on duty, his voice urgent but steady. "I need immediate pediatric evaluation. This baby was left outside." Natalie's eyes widened, but she acted quickly, ushering Michael into an exam room. Within minutes, a team of nurses and doctors swarmed around the infant, checking his vitals, assessing his condition. Michael stood at the edge of the room, his heart pounding. He was a highly skilled surgeon, trained to handle the most complex medical emergencies. But this was different. This was something else entirely. His temperature's low, one nurse murmured, wrapping the baby in a soft, heated blanket. "But he's stable," another added. "No signs of malnutrition or injury." Michael let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. After a series of thorough examinations, the baby was transferred to the hospital's pediatric ward. The attending social worker, Mrs. Ellen Brooks, soon arrived, her expression unreadable as she studied Michael. "No one has reported a missing child in the last few days," she said, flipping through a clipboard of notes. "And there are no identifying marks. No note, no indication of who his parents might be." Michael's jaw clenched. How could someone just leave a baby like this? "What happens to him now?" he asked. "He'll be placed in the system," Mrs. Brooks said matter-of-factly. "If no relatives come forward, he'll be assigned to foster care." Michael's stomach twisted at the thought. He had worked with enough foster children to know that the system, despite its best intentions, could be difficult for a child. Some kids never found permanent homes, shuffled from house to house, longing for stability, love, and security. He glanced at the infant, now sleeping peacefully in the hospital bassinet. His tiny fingers curled into a fist. Something inside Michael shifted. A realization, a decision forming even before he fully understood it himself. "I'll take him," he said suddenly. Mrs. Brooks blinked. "I'm sorry." Michael straightened. "I want to adopt him." The words came out firm, resolute, undeniable. "Dr. Anderson, this is a major decision," Mrs. Brooks cautioned. "You're a single man, a surgeon with a demanding career. And frankly, this town, it may not be the most accepting place for a black child in a white family." Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew what she meant. Willow Creek was a town deeply rooted in its ways, not outright hostile, but resistant to change. People talked, judged, whispered, but none of that mattered. Michael looked at the baby again and knew, without a doubt, that this was meant to be. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said, reaching out to gently stroke the baby's cheek. "His name will be Jason. Jason Anderson. And I promise I'll always be here for him, no matter what." The town's reaction. Word of Michael's decision spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. At Mabel's diner, the usual chatter over coffee and eggs was replaced with hushed gossip. "Did you hear about Dr. Anderson?" whispered Mrs. Johnson, the town's most dedicated gossip. "He adopted a black baby." Mr. Peterson, a retired teacher, shook his head. "A single man taking in a child. And a black child at that. That's going to cause trouble." At the hospital, Michael felt the shift immediately. His once warm colleagues suddenly seemed distant, their smiles forced, their conversations cut short when he walked by. Even his family wasn't immune. His mother, Margaret Anderson, called him over for dinner a few days later, her voice strained. As Michael sat at the dinner table with his parents and younger sister, the tension was suffocating. "Son," his father, Edward, started, clearing his throat. "We need to talk about Jason." Michael set his fork down, leveling his father with a steady gaze. "You mean my son?" Margaret reached for Michael's hand, her eyes pleading. "Honey, we're just concerned. Have you really thought this through? Raising a child is hard enough, but a black child in Willow Creek, it won't be easy." Michael's jaw clenched. He had expected pushback, but hearing it from his own parents stung. "I know it won't be easy," he said evenly, "but Jason needs me, and I need him." His sister, Karen, frowned. "But Michael, you're a surgeon. How will you balance work and raising a baby on your own?" Michael's voice was steady, unwavering. "I'll make it work." His father sighed heavily, shaking his head. "Son, you're not thinking clearly. People in this town won't accept this. They might even turn against you." Michael pushed his chair back, standing tall. "Then let them." His mother's eyes welled with tears. "We just want what's best for you." Michael exhaled, his voice softer now. "What's best for me is Jason. I hope you can accept that." As he left the house that night, he knew his life was about to change forever. Not just because he was now a father, but because he was about to face a town that didn't believe he should be one. A father's promise. The first few weeks with Jason were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, baby bottles, and an avalanche of doubts that kept Michael awake even when Jason wasn't crying. The once orderly, structured life of Dr. Michael Anderson had transformed overnight into one of chaos, but strangely enough, he didn't mind. He would sit for hours in the nursery, rocking Jason in his arms, whispering softly. "You are loved, little one," he murmured as he cradled him close. "I don't care what anyone says. You're mine, and I'll never let you go." It wasn't just exhaustion or the steep learning curve of fatherhood that weighed on him. It was the town, the people, the whispers. Michael knew small-town minds could be narrow, but he never imagined just how deep-seated their biases were until he became Jason's father. Cold shoulders and silent judgments. It started subtly. The smiles that used to greet him in the hospital hallways became tight-lipped nods. Conversations stopped when he entered the room, and some of his patients, longtime locals, suddenly requested different doctors. At first, Michael brushed it off. But the real test came one morning when he stopped by Mabel's diner, his go-to spot for coffee before his shift. The moment he walked in, the usual hum of chatter died down. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. He could feel their silent judgment like a heavy weight pressing against his chest. "Morning, Doc." Mabel, the diner's owner, greeted him. Her voice was polite, but there was a hesitation in it, something that hadn't been there before. Michael nodded, trying to act as if he didn't notice the sudden shift in the room. He approached the counter and placed his usual order. But then he heard it. Two women in the booth behind him whispered just loud enough for him to catch. "I still can't believe it. A white man raising a black baby. What's he trying to prove? He's ruining his reputation, that's for sure. Poor thing doesn't belong here." Michael clenched his jaw, gripping his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jason was not a poor thing. He was a child who deserved love. Instead of engaging, he took his coffee and walked out, heart hammering in his chest. But that wasn't the last time he'd hear it. He noticed it in the way his neighbors avoided eye contact, the way his colleagues hesitated before speaking to him. And one night, it got worse. A knock in the dark. It was just past midnight when Michael was jolted awake by a loud knocking on his front door. His heart pounded as he quickly pulled on a robe and hurried down the hall. He glanced at the baby monitor. Jason was still sleeping soundly. Another knock, this time louder. When he opened the door, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. Red spray paint, a single word scrawled across his porch. Traitor. Michael's breath caught in his throat. His fists clenched, his body rigid with anger. His gaze snapped to the figures standing at his doorstep. 3 men. Familiar faces. He recognized Tom Harper, the town mechanic, and beside him stood Walter Simmons and Rick Dawson, both longtime residents. Tom. Michael's voice was sharp with disbelief. "What the hell is this?" Tom had the decency to look uneasy, shifting from foot to foot, but Walter wasn't ashamed at all. "You need to think about what you're doing, Doc," Walter said, crossing his arms. "This ain't right." Michael took a slow, controlled breath. Raising a child isn't right. Giving him a home. Rick shook his head. Not a child like him. Not here. The weight of their words crashed into him like a wave. Jason was just a baby. A baby who had done nothing to deserve this hatred. And Michael, he had done nothing wrong except love him. "Get off my property," he said, his voice deadly calm. Tom hesitated, but Walter scoffed, turning on his heel. "You're making a mistake, Anderson." Michael didn't say another word. He watched them leave, fists still clenched, breath ragged. Then he turned to the vandalized porch. The word traitor burned into his mind. A traitor for loving a child. For protecting him. Michael slowly exhaled and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. He made his way to Jason's nursery, standing over the crib, watching the small, peaceful rise and fall of his son's chest. They would never understand. But they didn't have to. Michael would raise Jason to be strong, to be kind, to stand tall, even in the face of ignorance. He would not let hate define them. The family's ultimatum. The next morning, Michael received a call from his mother. "We need to talk," she said, her voice hesitant. "Come for dinner tonight." Michael knew what was coming. At exactly 6 p.m., he pulled up to his parents' home, a quaint 2-story house on Maple Street, the same house he had grown up in. The moment he stepped inside, he could feel the tension. His father, Edward Anderson, stood by the fireplace, arms crossed. His mother, Margaret, sat stiffly in her favorite chair, worry etched across her face. And his sister, Karen, met him with an unreadable expression. Michael took a deep breath. "All right. Say what you need to say." His father didn't waste time. "You need to reconsider this." Michael's chest tightened. "Reconsider what, Dad?" Margaret sighed, wringing her hands. "Michael, Jason is beautiful. We know you love him. But this town, this isn't the place for him." Michael's stomach twisted. "So what? You want me to give him up? Just because some people in this town can't handle it?" Edward's jaw tensed. "We're thinking about what's best for you. For him. The way people are treating you. This could ruin your career, your standing in this town." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "You think I care about my standing? My career?" He shook his head. "Jason is my son. I made a promise to him. I won't break it just because some people can't see past their own damn ignorance. Karen finally spoke, her voice softer than the rest. Mike, we're worried about the life he'll have here. The stares, the whispers, it's not fair to him. Michael met his sister's gaze. You know what's not fair? Abandoning him just because it's hard. His mother's eyes filled with tears. We just don't want to see you struggle. Michael's voice was raw when he replied, Then stand with me. Don't ask me to walk away from him. The silence was deafening. His father sighed, shaking his head. You've made up your mind. Michael nodded. I have. Margaret wiped at her eyes. Then I just hope you're ready for the consequences. Michael straightened. I am. With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving his family behind. A father's resolve. That night, as Michael rocked Jason to sleep, he whispered, No matter what, I got you. It didn't matter what the town thought. It didn't matter if people stared, if they whispered, if they painted words on his house. He would protect Jason. He would love him. And he would never let go. Because that's what being a father meant. The storm gathers. The first year with Jason was the hardest of Michael's life. He had spent years performing intricate surgeries, making life and death decisions in a sterile operating room. But nothing, not the pressure of the ER, not the long shifts, not the grueling residency years, compared to the challenge of single fatherhood. But as difficult as it was also the most rewarding. Every sleepless night, every bottle fed in the dead of night, every fussy tantrum, all of it was worth it when Jason would smile up at him, his tiny fingers curling around Michael's own. But outside the walls of their home, the storm was still brewing. The town of Willow Creek wasn't getting any kinder. If anything, the hostility was growing stronger. The unseen battle. Michael had anticipated challenges. He knew people would talk, but he hadn't expected the resistance to become active. It began subtly at first. One morning, he stopped by Mabel's diner to pick up breakfast. He had always loved their biscuits and gravy, but the moment he walked in, he noticed something was different. His usual seat at the counter was occupied. That wasn't strange in itself, but as he looked around, he realized there were empty seats. Except for that one. When he approached Mabel, she gave him a nervous smile. Sorry, Doc, she said hesitantly. No room today. Michael's eyes narrowed. There are at least 4 empty tables. Mabel's smile faltered. She glanced at the other customers, at the men sitting in their booths with their arms crossed, at the women who suddenly found their coffee cups very interesting. Michael felt his stomach churn. They weren't being subtle about it anymore. He set down his usual tip on the counter anyway, turning to leave. They could shun him all they wanted. He wouldn't stop loving his son. But the more he ignored them, the worse it got. At the hospital, patients started requesting different doctors. People who had trusted him for years, who had cried in his arms when he saved their loved ones, suddenly didn't want him touching them. And then came the call from the school. Jason faces the world. Jason was only 5 years old when he first realized he was different. Michael had tried to prepare him for the world, but nothing could prepare a child for the cruelty of small minds. One evening, Michael picked Jason up from press school. He could tell something was wrong the moment Jason climbed into his car seat. His usual bubbly energy was gone. He didn't chatter about his favorite toys or sing the silly songs he made up. Michael glanced at him in the rearview mirror. You okay, buddy? Jason didn't answer right away. He was staring down at his hands, fidgeting with the Velcro on his shoes. Some kid said I don't belong, he finally murmured. Michael's heart clenched. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. What do you mean? Jason shrugged. They said I don't look like you. They said I'm not really your son. The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Jason, you are my son. No matter what anyone says, that will never change. Jason's bottom lip trembled. But why do they care? Because people are cruel. Because they fear what they don't understand. because ignorance is easier than acceptance. Michael wanted to say all of that, but Jason was just a child. Instead, he reached back and squeezed Jason's hand. You don't have to look like someone to be family. Family is about love, not skin color. Jason was silent for a long time. Then he whispered, "Will people ever stop being mean?" Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. "I hope so, buddy." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The ultimatum. A few days later, the school called. Michael was at the hospital, midway through reviewing a patient's chart when his phone buzzed. Principal Thompson. He sighed, stepping into his office before answering. "Dr. Anderson speaking." "Dr. Anderson, we need to talk about Jason." Michael's stomach tightened. "What's wrong?" A pause. Then, in a calm but clipped voice, Principal Thompson said, "We've had several complaints from parents. They're concerned about the situation." Michael's jaw clenched. "The situation?" "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Some parents feel that Jason's presence is complicating things for the other children." Michael's grip on his phone tightened. "Let me get this straight. Are you telling me that my son is being bullied, and instead of addressing the bullies, you want to remove the victim?" Principal Thompson hesitated. "It's not that simple, Dr. Anderson. Some families, they don't believe." Michael cut him off. "I don't care what they believe. My son has as much of a right to be there as anyone else." A long silence. Then a sigh. "Dr. Anderson, I think you should consider relocating. For Jason's sake." Michael's blood ran cold. For Jason's sake. They wanted him to leave. Pack up, move away, pretend like this town had never existed. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "Thank you for your concern, Principal Thompson, but my son isn't going anywhere." And he hung up. A father's stand. That night, Michael sat on the edge of Jason's bed, watching his son drift off to sleep. He thought about leaving. It would be easier. He could move to a bigger city, somewhere Jason wouldn't stand out so much, somewhere people wouldn't question their family. But then he thought about why he stayed. He thought about the kids who had bullied Jason, the kids whose parents had raised them to believe he was different. If he left, the cycle would continue. The town would stay the same. And that wasn't good enough for Michael. He reached out, smoothing Jason's curls with gentle fingers. "You're going to change the world one day, kiddo," he whispered. Jason stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Michael leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "We're not going anywhere." And for the first time in months, he felt peace. He had spent his life saving strangers in an operating room. Now his most important job was saving his son, even if it meant standing against the whole town, even if it meant fighting alone. The breaking point. The weight of Michael's decision settled on him like a heavy storm cloud. Staying in Willow Creek meant constantly fighting against a wall of prejudice, against a town that had decided he and Jason didn't belong. But leaving? That would mean running. And if he ran now, what kind of lesson would that teach Jason? Michael had fought for his son since the moment he found him. He would not stop now. But he also knew the fight was far from over. The silent attacks began. At first, it was just words. The whispers at Mabel's diner grew louder. The judgmental stares at the grocery store became more pointed. People he had once considered friends, neighbors, colleagues refused to meet his gaze. Then it escalated. One afternoon, Michael left the hospital late, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, only to find that his car had been vandalized. Red paint smeared across the windshield. "Leave." Michael stood there, staring at the word, his fists clenching at his sides. He knew it was coming, but knowing and experiencing it were two different things. What hurt more than the act itself was the realization that someone in town had done this, someone he might have treated in the ER, someone who had probably shaken his hand after a successful surgery. Michael didn't call the police. What was the point? They wouldn't do anything. They'd call it a prank. So he cleaned his car in silence, wiping away the hatred, knowing full well it wouldn't be the last time. Jason's first real battle. Michael could handle the town's hostility. But Jason was just a kid. One afternoon, Jason came home from school with a busted lip. Michael was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, when he saw Jason walk in, head down, dragging his backpack. It took Michael exactly 3 seconds to notice the swelling on his lip. He dropped the wooden spoon and crouched in front of his son, gently tilting his chin up. "Jason," he said, keeping his voice steady, calm. "What happened?" Jason sniffled, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Some kids pushed me," he mumbled. "They said I don't belong here. That you're not my real dad." Michael inhaled sharply, fighting down the anger threatening to boil over. "I told them they were wrong," Jason continued, his voice trembling. "And they said I was a mistake. That I shouldn't be here." Michael closed his eyes. He wanted to storm into that school, demand names, make sure every single child who had hurt Jason was held accountable. But he couldn't always protect him. He couldn't shield Jason from the world forever. So instead, he pulled Jason into a hug, holding him tight. "I don't care what they say," Michael whispered into his son's curls. "You belong here. You belong with me." Jason trembled against him, tiny fingers gripping Michael's shirt like a lifeline. Michael took a deep breath. "Did you tell your teacher?" Jason shook his head. "They just watched," he admitted in a small voice. Michael's grip tightened. The teachers had done nothing. That night, Michael stayed awake for hours, sitting at his desk, staring at the school's contact list. Finally, he picked up the phone, confronting the system. The next morning, Michael marched into Willow Creek Elementary, jaw set, heart hammering. He wasn't here to be polite. He was here to fight. Principal Thompson's face paled when she saw him. "Dr. Anderson," she greeted him, forcing a smile. "I wasn't expecting." Michael cut her off. "Jason was attacked yesterday." Her smile faltered. Don't," Michael snapped. "Don't pretend you didn't know. My son came home with a busted lip, and no one in this school thought it was important enough to call me." The principal cleared her throat. "Dr. Anderson, you have to understand." "No," Michael interrupted again, voice low, dangerous. "You have to understand. Jason is not invisible. He is not a burden. And I will not sit by while your school allows him to be treated like he is." Principal Thompson sighed. "Dr. Anderson, this is a delicate situation. Some of the other children, their parents." "I don't give a damn about their parents," Michael snapped. "I care about my son, and I will not let you ignore this." Silence. Finally, the principal folded her hands on the desk. "What do you want us to do?" she asked, her voice resigned. Michael leaned forward. "I want every single teacher in this building to be made aware that bullying Jason will not be tolerated. I want those kids spoken to, their parents called. And I want your assurance that this will never happen again." Principal Thompson hesitated. Then, finally, she nodded. Michael didn't trust her, but he wasn't done fighting yet. A shift in the air. The town wasn't happy about Michael's confrontation with the school. Some of the parents of the bullies came to the hospital, not to apologize, but to complain. "We don't appreciate you stirring things up, doctor," one mother spat as Michael exited the hospital one evening. Michael stopped in his tracks. He had just spent 12 hours saving a man's life, and now he was standing in the parking lot, listening to a woman defend the kids who had hurt his son. "I don't give a damn what you appreciate," he said coolly. Her eyes widened. "You can teach your kids to be racist bullies all you want," he continued, voice sharp, deadly calm. "But I will make damn sure Jason doesn't have to suffer because of it." He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked away. That night, he went home, tucked Jason into bed, and knew that things were shifting. The town was beginning to turn against him completely. the fire. Michael knew he was pushing against the tide. He knew he was making enemies, but he never expected them to go this far. It was late, nearly midnight, when he woke to the sound of Jason screaming. Michael shot up in bed. Then he smelled it. Smoke. His heart stopped. He bolted out of bed, racing down the hall, and threw open Jason's door. His son was standing by the window, eyes wide with terror. Michael grabbed him, shielding him as he rushed toward the stairs, but the flames were already creeping up from the living room. The house was on fire. Michael's mind raced. The back door. The only way out. Holding Jason close, he sprinted toward the kitchen, ducking through the thickening smoke. By the time he burst out into the cold night, his lungs burned, his arms shaking. Jason was sobbing. Michael turned back to see his home, the home he had built for his son, engulfed in flames. His stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. This was a warning. This was a threat. But as he clutched Jason tighter, feeling the thunderous beat of his son's heart against his own, Michael made a vow. They wanted to scare him. They wanted him gone. But they had no idea who they were up against. Because now, it was war. Michael stood in the middle of the street, clutching Jason in his arms as the fire devoured their home. The orange and red flames twisted through the night sky, roaring like a wild animal unleashed from its cage. His home, their safe place, now reduced to burning rubble. Neighbors had gathered, standing in their driveways, some whispering, some just staring. None of them moved to help. Not one. The fire truck arrived within minutes, sirens wailing, but it was too late. Everything, Jason's crib, his toys, the nursery Michael had spent hours painting, the rocking chair where he had held his son through sleepless nights, all of it was gone. Jason sobbed into Michael's shoulder, his tiny hands clutching his father's shirt. Michael ran a hand over his back, whispering soothing words, but inside, he was burning too. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some random electrical fire. This was a message, and Michael understood it loud and clear. Get out. After the ashes settled, the fire marshal confirmed it the next morning. Arson. Someone had deliberately set fire to their home. Michael barely reacted when the officer told him. He just stood there, Jason curled up asleep in his arms, his face unreadable. "We'll investigate," the officer said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But in a town like this, Doc, you might want to consider if it's worth staying." Michael didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away. Nowhere left to go. Michael and Jason had nowhere to stay. Everything they owned had been in that house. Clothes, documents, baby pictures, Jason's first drawings, his favorite stuffed animals. Gone. For the first time since he found Jason, Michael felt lost. He had always been the one with answers, the one who fixed things, who saved people. But now, he couldn't even save their home. Mrs. Johnson, their elderly neighbor, offered them her spare bedroom, but Michael could see the nervous flicker in her eyes. She wanted to help, but she was afraid. Afraid of what the town might do if she did. "Thank you," Michael told her gently, "but we'll figure something out." So that night, he booked a motel room on the outskirts of town, far enough to feel safe, but close enough that he could still get to the hospital for his shifts. The moment he set Jason down on the motel bed, his son curled into a ball, exhausted, emotionally drained. Michael sat beside him, smoothing a hand over his curls. "It's gonna be okay, buddy," he whispered. Jason didn't respond. For the first time, Michael saw fear in his son's eyes. Not fear of monsters under the bed. Not fear of the dark. Fear of the people outside. And Michael, he felt something different entirely. Rage. Not the kind of anger that flashes hot and fades away. The kind that burns slow. The kind that doesn't forget. The hospital turns against him. Michael went back to work the next day, running on nothing but coffee and pure, simmering fury. He thought maybe, just maybe, someone would offer words of support. But instead, he walked through the hospital hallways and felt the shift. The way people avoided his eyes. The way conversations died the moment he entered a room. By lunchtime, he was called into Dr. Stevens' office. Michael sat stiffly in the chair across from his supervisor, waiting. Dr. Stevens sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Michael," he began carefully, "the board has been discussing your situation." Michael's jaw clenched. "My situation?" Dr. Stevens hesitated. "The fire, the hostility from the town." He leaned forward. "Look, Michael, you're a damn good doctor, but the hospital is under pressure from the community. Some patients are refusing to be treated by you, and the board is concerned." Michael's fingers curled into fists. "Concerned," he repeated flatly. "About what?" "That I'm an excellent surgeon, that I saved dozens of lives last week." Dr. Stevens sighed. "It's politics, Michael. I'm not a politician. I'm a doctor. And the hospital is a business," Dr. Stevens said firmly. "A business that relies on donations, on community trust." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "So what are you saying?" Dr. Stevens hesitated. Then, softly, "The board is asking you to take a leave of absence." Michael stilled. A slow, sinking feeling took hold in his chest. "You're suspending me," he said quietly. Dr. Stevens wouldn't meet his gaze. Michael stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I have a son to take care of," he said coldly. Dr. Stevens finally looked up, guilt flickering in his eyes. "Michael, please, just think about what's best for Jason." Michael's entire body went rigid. "What's best for Jason," he said slowly, "is having a father who doesn't run, who doesn't back down just because the world makes it hard." Dr. Stevens didn't answer. Michael turned and walked out. Enough is enough. That night, Michael didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the dark window, listening to Jason's soft breathing beside him. He had given this town his life, his expertise, his heart, his loyalty. And they had burned down his home. They had taken his job. They had tried to scare him away. And worst of all, they had made his son afraid. Michael exhaled slowly, his anger no longer hot but cold. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts. And then, for the first time in years, he made a call. When the person on the other end picked up, Michael didn't hesitate. "I need a lawyer." A pause. Then, "Michael?" His old friend, David Holloway, one of the best civil rights attorneys in the state. Michael's voice was steady, unwavering. "They took my house," he said. "They took my job. They bullied my son." Another pause. Then, "I'll be there in the morning." Michael hung up, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something new. Not fear, not doubt, hope, because this town wanted a fight. Then they were damn well about to get one. The war for Jason's future had just begun. The war begins. The morning after Michael made the call, he sat by the motel window, staring out at the quiet town of Willow Creek, a place that had once been his home but had now become his battlefield. Jason was still asleep, curled beneath the motel's stiff sheets, his tiny body rising and falling with each breath. Michael clenched his jaw. He would not fail his son. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Michael got up and opened it to see David Holloway, his old friend and one of the best civil rights attorneys in the state. David was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of presence that commanded a courtroom. His sharp, knowing gaze immediately took in Michael's exhausted face. "Damn, Mike," he muttered, stepping inside. "I thought you were calling me for a reunion. Didn't expect a full-blown war." Michael let out a humorless chuckle. "I didn't expect it either." David set down his briefcase and crossed his arms. "Tell me everything." And so Michael did. The whispers, the vandalism, the school's complicity, the arson, the hospital forcing him out. By the time he finished, David's jaw was tight with rage. "This town is a lawsuit waiting to happen," he muttered. Michael exhaled. "Can we win?" David's expression hardened. "We don't just win, Mike. We expose them. We make sure the world sees exactly what they did to you and Jason." For the first time in weeks, Michael felt something shift. Hope. The first strike. By midday, David had drafted 3 legal complaints. A discrimination lawsuit against Willow Creek General Hospital for unjustly suspending Michael due to racial bias. A lawsuit against Willow Creek Elementary School for failing to protect Jason from targeted bullying. A demand for a full police investigation into the arson, naming specific individuals Michael suspected were involved. David handed Michael the printed copies. "Once I file these, there's no going back," he said. Michael stared down at the papers, at the weight of them. This was his line in the sand. He met David's gaze. "Do it. The town reacts." The moment the lawsuits were filed, all hell broke loose. It started with whispers. Then it turned into angry phone calls to the hospital, protests outside the school, and a town-wide uproar. Michael was no longer just the doctor who had adopted a black child. He was now the man taking Willow Creek to war. The threats begin. A week later, Michael was walking out of the motel with Jason when he noticed a black truck parked across the street. The same truck had been following them for days. Inside sat Tom Harper, Walter Simmons, and Rick Dawson, the same men who had vandalized his home, the same men he suspected of the fire. Michael felt his pulse quicken as he locked eyes with Tom. Tom grinned, slow and menacing, before rolling down his window. "You should leave while you still can, Anderson," he said smoothly. Michael's grip tightened around Jason's hand. Jason looked up at him, confused. "Dad?" Michael knelt down beside him, keeping his voice calm. "Go inside, buddy. I'll be right there." Jason hesitated, then nodded and ran back into the motel room. Michael turned back to the men. "You want to threaten me? Do it to my face." Tom laughed, shaking his head. "This ain't a threat, Doc. It's a warning. You're making a mistake. You're turning this town against you." Michael stepped closer. He wasn't afraid anymore. "This town was already against me," he said coldly. "And I'm still here." Walter leaned forward from the driver's seat. "You think some fancy lawsuit is gonna change anything?" Michael smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No," he said, "but it'll make sure people know exactly what kind of men you are." Tom's grin faltered, and for the first time, Michael saw something new in their eyes. Fear, not fear of him. Fear of the truth. He didn't say another word. He turned and walked inside, locking the door behind him. He heard the truck rev its engine and speed away. The town meeting. A few nights later, Willow Creek held a town meeting. Michael wasn't invited, but he went anyway. The meeting was held in the community hall, packed with furious townspeople. Michael stood in the back, arms crossed, as he listened to them tear him apart. "He's ruining this town," someone shouted. "We don't need outsiders telling us how to live. He's playing the victim, trying to make us look like racists." Michael inhaled sharply. Jason. They weren't just attacking him anymore. They were attacking his son. That was it. He had heard enough. Michael stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "If you have something to say," he said, "say it to my face." Silence fell. Then, the mayor stepped forward. "Dr. Anderson," the mayor said stiffly, "you've put this town in a difficult position." Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This town put me in a difficult position when it tried to burn down my home." Murmurs swept through the crowd. The mayor sighed. "Look, we understand that you feel mistreated. You think this is about feelings." Michael interrupted, his voice rising. "This is about a child who was bullied while the school did nothing. About a hospital that forced out a doctor, not because of his skills, but because of his son's skin color." He took another step forward. "This is about a town that thinks hate is tradition. Angry mutters rippled through the crowd. Michael didn't back down. "You all want me gone," he said. "Too bad. I'm not leaving. I'm not running. And I'm sure as hell not afraid of you." Someone scoffed. "You're making a mistake, Anderson." Michael's eyes flashed. "No," he said. "You all did, when you came after my son." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the town in silence. The turning point. A week later, the first legal ruling came in. The judge ruled in Michael's favor against Willow Creek General Hospital. They were ordered to reinstate him immediately and issue a formal public apology. It was a massive victory. The media caught wind of it. And suddenly, Willow Creek wasn't just a small town anymore. It was national news. Reporters flooded the streets, cameras rolled, and for the first time, the town's secrets were out in the open. A father's victory. 2 weeks later, Michael stood outside his new house, a modest home just outside of town. Jason ran ahead, laughing, chasing a butterfly. Michael watched him, a slow smile spreading across his face. They had tried to break him, tried to burn him out, but he was still here, and he had won. As Jason turned back and ran into his arms, Michael held him tight. "No one is ever going to take you from me," he whispered. Jason hugged him back. "I know, Dad." And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Michael believed it. The war was over. And Jason had a future, no matter what anyone said. The legacy of love. The battle had been won, but the scars remained. Michael had forced Willow Creek to face its own darkness. The lawsuits had shaken the town to its core, making headlines across the state. The hospital had reinstated him. The school had been forced to publicly acknowledge its failure to protect Jason. The arson investigation had been reopened, and Tom Harper, Walter Simmons, and Rick Dawson were now under scrutiny. But despite the victories, Michael knew one thing for certain: the town would never forget. And neither would he. The aftermath. Michael had chosen to stay, not because he loved the town. He didn't. Not anymore. But because Jason deserved to grow up knowing that no one could push them out. They had tried. They had vandalized his home, threatened his family, set fire to his house, tried to get him fired. But through it all, he had refused to break. And now, as he walked Jason to school on a crisp autumn morning, he noticed the way people looked at them. Some still whispered, some still turned away, but others nodded in acknowledgement. Some even smiled. Change was slow, but it was happening. The fear in people's eyes was being replaced with something else, something Michael had never expected. Respect. A new home, a new beginning. A few weeks after moving into their new home, Jason sat cross-legged on the living room floor, coloring. Michael watched him from the kitchen, a soft smile on his lips. Jason's tiny fingers carefully gripped the crayons as he worked. His curls bounced every time he moved his head. Michael set down his coffee and walked over, crouching beside him. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Jason beamed up at him. "It's us." Michael looked at the paper. There were 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of a house. Above them, Jason had written in big wobbly letters, "Fayam." Michael felt a lump form in his throat. "That's beautiful, Jason," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jason's smile faltered slightly. "Are we gonna be okay, Dad?" Michael exhaled slowly. He knew what Jason meant. The town hadn't forgotten. The people who had hurt them were still there. The fire had stolen more than just their home. It had stolen their sense of safety. Michael reached out, gently brushing Jason's curls. "Yes," he said firmly. "We're going to be just fine." Jason searched his father's face, then nodded. "Okay," he whispered. And just like that, Michael knew he had made the right choice. No matter how hard it had been, Jason felt safe now. And that was all that mattered. The final battle. 2 months after the fire, the arson investigation came to a head. Michael got a call from Detective Grant, the state investigator who had taken over the case after local police failed to act. "We have evidence linking Tom Harper to the fire," Grant said. "We found accelerant residue at the scene that matches what he keeps in his garage." Michael's breath caught. They had proof. "What happens next?" he asked. "We're arresting him tonight." Michael exhaled. Finally, justice was coming. The arrest. The entire town watched as Tom Harper was led away in handcuffs. For the first time, Michael saw fear in Tom's eyes. Not fear of Michael. Fear of accountability. Fear of losing. And in that moment, Michael knew he had won. A town that could change. As the seasons changed, so did Willow Creek. Slowly, but surely. A few months after Tom's arrest, Michael was invited to speak at a town hall event. He almost didn't go. But Jason needed to see it. He needed to see that change was possible. So Michael took the stage, facing the people who had tried to break him. And he spoke. Not about hatred. Not about revenge. But about love. About fatherhood. About how family wasn't about blood, but about choice. By the time he finished, there was silence. And then, applause. Not everyone. Not the ones who would never change. But enough. Enough to give Michael hope. The future they deserved. Years passed. Jason grew up in Willow Creek. He made friends. He learned to stand up for himself. The town never fully changed, but it changed enough. Enough that Michael no longer feared for his son's safety. Enough that Jason could walk through the halls of his school without feeling like an outcast. Enough that, one day, when Jason was older, he could look back and know that his father had fought for him. That Michael had never wavered. Never given up. Never backed down. And as Michael watched his son step onto the stage at his high school graduation, he felt something deep, profound. Pride. Not just for Jason, but for himself. For the fight they had won. For the family they had built. For the future they had secured, together. And as Jason stood at the podium, looking out over the town that had once rejected him, he smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an uncertain smile. A smile filled with confidence, with purpose, with the knowledge that he belonged. And when Jason's eyes met Michael's in the crowd, Michael knew. No matter what had happened, no matter what they had faced, they had won. Because love always wins.